I'm Sarah, survivor, author, speaker, and clarity coach. I train sheroes into trauma-sensitive advocate coaches, and I teach survivors of betrayal trauma and post-separation abuse how to get safe, stable, and strong. Welcome to my Jesus bubble. Let's have a gentle, quiet moment together that's good for your soul. So a long time ago, as in 6 or 7 years ago, I started doing a Jesus bubble with my friends right here on the internet. Now, when I started calling it Jesus bubble, it was because I had very young children. I was a single parent, and I would wake up early and try to have some quiet time with God. And it seemed like if I slept in, they slept in. And if I woke up early, the earlier I woke up, the earlier they woke up. And so I started calling it. I told them that I was in a little bubble with Jesus, and I didn't want them to pop my bubble, and they were welcome to come and join my bubble, but they needed to be quiet and let me have my bubble with Jesus. So we started calling Mommy's Prayer Time my Jesus bubble. My kids are big, huge teenagers now, way taller than me, and they still call Quiet Time with Jesus their Jesus bubble. Well, when I was going through cancer treatment and chemotherapy and radiation, there wasn't much I could do here on my Facebook page to stay connected with people except share my Jesus bubble. And so there was a season of time where I simply shared my devotional time on my Facebook page, and that was all I had the energy to do. And after a while, I got stronger, I got better, I was in remission. I'm still in complete remission, thank you, Jesus. But I haven't done a Jesus bubble series in a very long time, and a lot of people have asked about it. So I decided that this fall, with the beginning of school, I would start Jesus bubble again. And we are going to go through this fabulous book that is one of my favorites. It's authored by Hannah Hernard. It is not my book, and it's called Hinds Feet on High Places. This one has the most beautiful illustrations. I will drop the details to get that in one of the comments underneath after this is done. And let me tell you a little bit about it. See, aren't these illustrations gorgeous? Hinds Feet on High Places is an allegory. Think like Pilgrim's Progress or other great allegories. This one is a very simple one, and it's about suffering and fear. And you know what? There is probably not one other topic that my wild audience, you, can relate to more than the topic of suffering and fear. So together, we are going to read. And I'm just going to set a timer for about 10 minutes. And we will read together, and then we'll stop. And then we'll do it again tomorrow morning. All right? So let's get started. Part 1. Weeping. Ooh, let's get it focused. There we go. Is that better? It's just not going to focus on that, is it? There we go. Weeping may endure for a night. Psalm 30, verse 5. Chapter 1, the invitation to the high places. This is the story of how Much Afraid, that's her name, escaped from her fearing relatives and went with the shepherd to the high places, where perfect love casteth out fear. For several years, Much Afraid had been in the service of the chief shepherd, whose great flocks were pastured down in the valley of humiliation. She lived with her friends and fellow workers Mercy and Peace in a tranquil little white cottage in the village of Much Trembling. She loved her work and desired intensely to please the chief shepherd. But happy as she was in most ways, she was conscious of several things which hindered her in her work and caused her much secret distress and shame. In the first place, she was a cripple, with feet so crooked that they often caused her to limp and stumble as she went about her work. She also had the very unsightly blemish of a crooked mouth, which greatly disfigured both expression and speech, and was sadly conscious that these ugly blemishes must be a cause of astonishment and offense to many who knew that she was in the service of the great shepherd. Most earnestly, she longed to be completely delivered from these shortcomings and to be made beautiful, gracious, and strong, as were so many of the other shepherd's workers, and above all, to be made like the chief shepherd himself. But she feared that there could be no deliverance from these two crippling disfigurements, and that they must continue to mar her service always. There was, however, another and even greater trouble in her life. She was a member of the family of Fearings, and her relatives were scattered all over the valley, so that she could never really escape them. An orphan, she had been brought up in the home of her aunt, poor Mrs. Dismal Forebodings, with her two cousins, Gloomy and Spiteful, and their brother, Craven Fear, a great bully who habitually tormented and persecuted her in a dreadful way. Like most of the other families who lived in the Valley of Humiliation, all the Fearings hated the chief shepherd and tried to boycott his servants. And naturally, it was a great offense to them that one of their own family should have entered his service. Consequently, they did all they could, both by threats and persuasions, to get her out of the shepherd's employment, and one dreadful day they laid before her the family dictum that she must immediately marry her cousin, Craven Fear, and settle down respectably among her own people. If she refused to do this of her own free will, they threatened to use force and compel her. Poor Much Afraid was, of course, overwhelmed with horror at the mere idea. But her relatives always terrified her, and she had never learned to resist or ignore their threats. So she simply sat cowering before them, repeating again and again that nothing would induce her to marry Craven Fear, but she was quite unable to escape their presence. The unhappy interview therefore lasted a long time, and when they finally did leave her for a while, it was already early evening. With a surge of relief, Much Afraid remembered that the chief shepherd would then be leading his flocks to their accustomed watering place beside a lovely cascade and pool on the outskirts of the village. To this place, she was in the habit of going very early every morning to meet him and learn his wishes and commands for the day, and again to go in the evenings to give her report on the day's work. It was now time to meet him there beside the pool, and she felt sure he would help her and not permit her relatives to kidnap her and force her to leave his service for the dreadful slavery of marriage with Craven Fear. Still shaking with fear, and without pausing to wash the tears from her face, Much Afraid shut the door of her cottage and started off for the cascade and the pool. In the quiet evening light, the Valley of Humiliation was filled with a golden glow as she left the village and started to cross the fields. Beyond the river, the mountains which bounded the eastern side of the valley like towering ramparts were already tinged with pink, and their deep gorges were filled with lovely and mysterious shadows. Through the quiet and the peace of this tranquil evening, poor, terrified Much Afraid came to the pool where the shepherd was waiting for her and told him of her dreadful plight. "What shall I do?" she cried as she ended the recital of her fears. "How can I escape? They can't really force me to marry my cousin Craven, can they?" "Oh," cried she, overwhelmed again at the very thought of such a prospect. It is dreadful enough to be much afraid, but to think of having to be Mrs. Craven Fear for the rest of my life and never be able to escape from the torment of it is more than I can bear. Don't be afraid, said the shepherd gently. You are in my service. Excuse me. And if you trust me, they will not be able to force you against your will into any family alliance. But you ought never to have let your fearing relatives into your cottage. They are enemies of the king who has taken you into his employment. Oh, I know, cried Much Afraid, but whenever I meet any of my relatives, I seem to lose all my strength, and I simply cannot resist them, no matter how I strive. As long as I live in the valley, I cannot escape meeting them. They are everywhere, and now that they are determined to get me into their power again, I shall never dare venture outside my cottage alone for fear of being kidnapped. As she spoke, she lifted her eyes and looked across the valley and the river to the lovely sunset-lighted peaks of the mountains, and then cried out in desperate longing, "Oh, if only I could escape from this valley of humiliation altogether and go to the high places, completely out of reach of all the fearings and my other relatives." No sooner were her words uttered when, to her complete astonishment, the shepherd answered, "I have waited a long time to hear you make that suggestion, Much Afraid. It would indeed be best for you to leave the valley for the high places, and I will very willingly take you there myself. The lower slopes of those mountains on the other side of the river are the borderland of my father's kingdom, the realm of love. No fears of any kind are able to live there, because perfect love casts out fear and everything that torments." Much Afraid stared at him in amazement. "Go to the high places," she exclaimed, "and live there? Oh, if only I could! For months past, the longing has never left me. I think of it day and night, but it is not possible. I could never get there. I am too crippled." She looked down at her malformed feet as she spoke, and her eyes again filled with tears and despair and self-pity. "These mountains are so steep and dangerous. I have been told that only the hinds and the deer can move on them safely." "It is quite true that the way up to the high places is both difficult and dangerous," said the shepherd. "It has to be, so that nothing which is an enemy of love can make the ascent and invade the kingdom. Nothing blemished or in any way imperfect is allowed there, and the inhabitants of the high places do need hinds' feet. I have them myself," he added with a smile, "and like a young hart or a roebuck, I can go leaping on the mountains and skipping on the hills with the greatest of ease and pleasure. But Much Afraid, I could make yours like hinds' feet also, and set you upon the high places. You could serve me then much more fully, and be out of reach of all your enemies. I am delighted to hear that you have been longing to go there, for as I said before, I have been waiting for you to make that suggestion." Then he added, with another smile, "You would never have to meet Craven Fear again." Much Afraid stared at him in bewilderment. "Make my feet like hinds' feet," she repeated. "How is that possible? And what would the inhabitants of the kingdom of love say to the presence of a wretched little cripple with an ugly face and a twisted mouth, if nothing blemished and imperfect may dwell there?" "It is true," said the shepherd, "that you would have to be changed before you could live on the high places. But if you are willing to go with me, I promise to help you develop hinds' feet up there in the mountains. As you get near the real high places, the air is fresh and invigorating. It strengthens the whole body, and there are streams with wonderful healing properties, so that those who bathe in them find all their blemishes and disfigurements washed away. That's our mark for time. We will start this again tomorrow morning. Now I'm going to try to do this at 7 a.m. Eastern Time each morning, or at least each weekday morning, as we work through this book, Hinds Feet on High Places. This is a perfect time for you to tag a friend who might want to journey along on our allegory, and share it, repost it on your own page if you want. I promise I won't take up too much of your time each morning, and it will be a gentle, quiet moment that's good for your soul. Now, if you're stumbling through the next steps for healing after abuse or trauma or post-separation abuse or betrayal, I would love for you to come join The Scoop, which is my live coaching club, for just $9 a month from the link in my comments. It is a place where you can have a lot more gentle, quiet, nourishing moments for your soul. And I'll see you tomorrow.